Now, good afternoon and welcome to our virtual program, Positive Parenting. We are very grateful to have Doctors Stephen Carries and Brett Biller with us today. A little bit about our speakers. Dr. Carries is a professor of pediatrics at the Hackensack Meridian School of Medicine. He serves as medical director of the New Jersey American Academy of Pediatric Council on Research and Education. He served for 10 years as medical director of the National American Academy of Pediatrics Quality Improvement and Innovation Networks. He is board certified in general pediatrics, adolescent medicine, and child abuse and neglect. He was awarded Pediatrician of the Year in 1987 in New Hampshire and in 2012 in New Jersey. Dr. Carries is principal investigator for a $15.8 million 7-year collaborative agreement with the Centers for Medicaid and Medicare Innovation to transform care for children in New Jersey who receive Medicaid. This project began in January 2020. He is co-primary investigator on a New Jersey statewide program to improve mental health services for children by developing a collaborative model between primary care pediatrics and child psychiatry. He has worked for many years in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union in improving healthcare for women and children. Dr. Carries previously was the chairman of pediatrics at Dartmouth Medical School in Hanover, New Hampshire, the Robert Wood Johnson Medical School in New Brunswick, and at Jersey Shore University Medical Center. Since receiving his doctoral degree from Pace University, New York, Brett Biller has maintained employment at 3 of New Jersey's 4 legislatively designated regional diagnostic and treatment centers. As a licensed psychologist working with children and families who have been impacted by maltreatment, Dr. Biller has had the privilege to work clinically with children, adolescents, and families from diverse socioeconomic and ethnic backgrounds who have experienced varied maltreatment, including physical and sexual abuse, neglect, and exposure to domestic violence. He has conducted forensic evaluations as well as provided ongoing individual and group therapy. He additionally consults and provides educational lectures to schools, child welfare agencies, law enforcement, and other medical and mental health professionals, as well as provide expert and fact testimony in criminal and civil hearings. Dr. Biller was the founding director of the training at Dorothy B. Hirsch at St. Peter's University Hospital in New Brunswick, New Jersey, where he developed and directed a forensic doctoral training program. He currently serves as the mental health director, section chief at the Audrey Hepburn Children's House at Hackensack University Medical Center. Dr. Biller has also served in leadership roles within several professional organizations, including the executive board president of the American Professional Society on the Abuse of Children, New Jersey chapter, the chair of the New Jersey Psychological Association's Committee on Legislative Affairs, and as the member at large of the New Jersey Psychological Association's executive board. So at this time, I will now turn it over to Dr. Carries to get started.
Great, thank you, Allison. Can I have the first slide? So our hope today is to give you some background and some information about positive parenting, which to me means how to raise a responsible child. To me, one of the major goals of being a parent is to raise a child who is socially competent, who is able to make good decisions, be responsible, to have good self-esteem, and to be an empathic, caring human being. I think that for all of us, that's the hope for all of our children is to be responsible adults. And there's 2 major thoughts I want you to carry with you. The first is that parenting is something that you don't do at the last minute. You don't have a toddler act out and then decide what to do. You have to have ahead of time some thinking about how you want to parent and how you'd like to be able to provide support for your child. And you want to do it with your significant other or your spouse. It's not particularly constructive to have one parent have one idea, another parent have a different idea. That's very complicated for a child to understand and figure out. It's so much better if both parents work together, think ahead of time, and agree, even if it sometimes takes some compromise or negotiations on how they're going to be raising their children. Because really, children are really all different. You can have 3 or 4 kids in a family. They all have different backgrounds, temperaments, different approaches. So even in the same family, every child is a different approach. And then as adults, as you know for yourself, that adults are also all different with different backgrounds, different issues, different approaches. So to raise a responsible child, it means understanding a lot of that background and thinking about it ahead of time. Next slide. So again, as children grow and change, so do adults. So you're not a static individual. An adult at 25 is different in how they look at the world than an adult at 55. So it's a learning process for children as they grow older. Certainly a learning process for adults. Next slide. So let's get into it. So if the goal is to raise a responsible child, to me there's some basic tenets that are well worth talking about. First is that you have to understand where their behavior is coming from. Children do what they do to gain attention for the most part, and many kids will use negative behavior to gain attention if they don't get what they want from positive attention. So you have to understand that particular child and what it is that's really motivating them, because how you respond to them is in part based on what you understand about how they are and how they're dealing with their environments. And one of the goals always is to try to build their self-esteem, not to tear them down, not to see them as people that are bad or that are just not being helpful or just not living up to your expectations. You really want to work as a parent to help them feel better about themselves in a way that is structured and meets your needs also. So, because responsible people really have high self-esteem, they care about others, and as a parent, that's what you want to be able to try to do with your own children. Next slide. So part of this is giving them responsibility, not doing things for them. So many families expect children to do things. When they don't do it, they take over, they do it for them, they scream, they holler at the kids, but in the end, they're not really teaching them how to take on those responsibilities and to figure out how to get through it themselves. Sometimes kids have to learn that what they've done is not in their best interest, not learn from you, but learn from the environment around them. So they have to, over time, be given responsibility as long as you're comfortable with what the decisions could be. And like I say, you have to decide when problems arise, are they child related or is it really your own issue? You're having a bad day, you're having problems. Sometimes the issues really reside in you and not with your child. And you have to be able to understand that and think about how that is different, and how you approach it is also different. Next slide. So we're going to talk a lot about consequences and not punishments. So as you'll hear later, punishments are, to me, it's what happens when somebody who's bigger and stronger and more in charge tells somebody who's weaker and younger about what they should be doing, rather than having that child hopefully learn that what they're doing does have some consequences, but it makes sense based on what the actual action is. It holds them responsible for their behaviors. It's not the parent taking over and being the chief of police for the family. It's always really helpful to listen to your children. So many times there's very little interaction that goes on in a family. In some studies, the average teenager spends maybe 10 minutes a day at most actually talking with the family. So learning to talk, to listen, to really just enjoy your kids is such an important issue to think about. Sometimes when things are happening, the best thing to do is to talk about it from your perspective. I feel sad when you talk to your sister that way. It's such, rather than to put the blame on them and to give them those messages that go with guilt and shame and make it really difficult for a child to get through those sorts of conversations. Next slide. If you can, give the child some choices. All the choices have to be ones that you're comfortable with, but if you can allow them to make some decisions without having to be always dictated to, they'll learn how to make better decisions themselves. Your job as parent is to be teacher and mentor, not to be their guardian and their police person. And again, try to involve them as best you can, knowing that you're still in charge. They're not in charge. You control the family, but in that context, you can permit them to share in some of the rules and some of the alternatives that they approach. As they get older, that's more and more an important issue. Next slide. So, part of being responsible is to accept kids as they are. As I said, every child's different. They have different approaches. Some kids are introverts, some are extroverts, some are impulsive, some are not impulsive. And as you do that, you want to be able to do it in a way that makes them feel good as a person. You don't want to be screaming and yelling and hollering at them. You wouldn't like it if that happened to you. Kids don't like it if it happens to them. They still need limits. They still need structure, but you can do it in the spirit of friendliness, in the spirit of showing that you enjoy them as people, despite what some of their actions are. Next slide. And part of taking responsibility is being independent. If you do things for them, if the child's always late getting up in the morning and you have to get them up and getting ready for school and get them to school because they missed the bus, well then there's no independence learned there. Your job is not to enable them, not to kind of shield them from some of their consequences of their actions. You have to be able to help them over time become independent and to take charge of their own lives. The more self-sufficient they are, the more they're able to make decisions, they'll feel better, and you have a much better relationship with your child. Next slide. Also, don't pity your child. Pity and shame and guilt, I think those are emotions that are very tough for a child to deal with and to understand. Nobody wants to be pitied. Certainly children don't want to be pitied. Again, they want to be treated as people that you care about, that you respect. Things like saying you helpless child are not words that inspire a lot of growth and self-esteem building for that child. Next slide. Likewise, kids are going to get discouraged as part of going through life. Your job is not to protect them from discouragement, but to help them work through that. As they work through it, their confidence will increase and improve, so that again, part of what I see a lot in parents is them saying one thing, but in the end trying to somewhat protect their child from learning from some of the actions that they have taken. Next slide. So let's talk about this idea of natural and logical consequences. Again, the idea is that take it for yourself. If you're late for work, you may not have your job. Your employer may come down at you. If you're don't put gas in the car, then the logical consequences, you're probably not going to drive that day. So the consequence is based on the action. It's not the child does something and so they get punished by being grounded for 3 weeks, or they get those are power plays. They don't get hit. They don't get yelled at and shamed. Those are punishments that are kids learn how to deal with that, and they certainly make some modifications with their behavior. In the end, it's not really growing them in terms of their abilities to take responsibility, feel better about themselves, feel like they really have a relationship with you that shows goodwill and where choices are being accepted. Next slide. So again, the goal is, as we'll talk about, show you some example. And natural consequences, as you would expect, if you don't eat, you're going to get hungry. That's a natural consequence of your actions. The logical consequences, like I say, are ones that are very much based on the behavior that's being represented. For example, Many kids do what they do for attention, as I've told you, particularly toddlers and younger kids. And a natural consequence is just to ignore them or to not give them the attention that they seek. The more times you scream and yell, you're just giving them the attention that they crave. And in a way, it just incents them to do even more of those bad behaviors. Being able to walk away, sometimes take a time out for yourself, make sure they're in a safe place. But if you don't give them the attention when they're acting out, and then on the other hand, if you give them attention when they're being great, then that's give them praise, talk to them, give them support, spend time with them when they're being good. That is a consequence that really makes a big difference particularly for younger kids. Next slide. So again, the whole goal, as I said, is to learn from their consequences, their actions, and to have them see it as connected to their particular behaviors. Next slide. Again, some other principles about how you do that. You want to be firm. What you don't want to do is do it one way one day and then change your mind the next day. If this is important to you, then you're going to do it in every day, not because they're having a good day or you're having a good day. These are the rules. This is the structure. This is how we do things in this family. But you also want to do it with some kindness and some humor and to caring about them as an individual. In general, just talk less. I've seen so many families where they spend so much time talking at and kind of talking down or screaming or I'm going to take this away, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that. How many times have you seen kids in a supermarket where the parents are screaming at their kid but not going to McDonald's, and then they go to McDonald's anyway when it's all over? So just talk less and act more. If you're going to have responses and consequences, then be consistent and be supportive. And as I said, don't do things for your kids that they can do for themselves. That's just robbing them of self-respect and responsibility. Let them handle it. Let them figure it out. Give them several options, and both of which that you are comfortable with, and let them figure out which ones they want to do. And try to avoid fights. You're going to get into fights. That's part of being a parent. There's always emotions involved with being a parent. But the more that you can plan ahead, know what's going to happen, think this through, anticipate, it's so much better. But if you're going to fight, then you have to win those fights. You're not going to give in. So, next slide. So again, you want to provide some choices as the kids get older. You want to do this in a way that provides some sense of goodwill. You want to follow through. If it's repeated again, then you may want to extend the time before the child is allowed to do it again. In general, with the consequence, it's not a forever thing. It's for a period of time, and then you try it again. It's maybe for that day or several days, and then you give them a chance to try it again, see how much they've learned, and try it again. It takes time. It takes time to change behavior. It takes time for this to be effective. So you have to be patient. Some kids are much more impulsive and difficult than others, so it's very much child-related. Next slide. So again, if you're punishing, then you're basically saying, I'm in charge. This is the way it is. Do what I say because I say so. And kids do respond to it, but in the end, some kids, they sneak, they hide, they don't tell you. Most kids figure out how to get what they need despite the environment set up at home. Whereas with logical consequences, it's really just saying, I trust you to make the right decisions. You're trying to build cooperation and self-discipline and a sense of reliability. Next slide. So again, with punishment, it's somewhat arbitrary. You're going to just take things away. You're going to ground them. You're going to whatever. You're going to spank them. Whatever it is, I'll show you. But again, it's not logically connected to what happened. It's not like they understand there's a connection between your response and what happened. And if there's really learning from it, it's only just learning that because of fear that they're not going to do this in front of you, at least. It also implies punishment implies a moral judgment that they're bad or they're not acceptable, which leads to guilt and shame, which are really horrible emotions that have to grow up with, rather than treating them as a person that you still respect and has some dignity, and that they're still a worthwhile person, that maybe has done something that's not right, but they're still, have a lot of positive attributes. Next slide. I'm going to skip this. Let's go on to the next slide. We'll get to this, some of these things later. So
here's we've passed our time, so I'm not sure if you want to pass the mic to Dr. Biller or just quickly wrap up.
Okay, let me just wrap up. Just a couple of examples and I'll wrap up. So here's, again, if they're not doing chores, they maybe have a family meeting. If their goal is to feed the pet first, it is to feed the pet, and they're not doing it, then maybe a logical consequences, they don't get fed till the pet gets fed first. If they can't get up in the morning, then the logical consequence, they have to deal with the principal. It's not your job to protect them from school. They have to figure out how to do it themselves. Because in the end, it's really about that helping them to learn how to make decisions that make sense, that give them a sense of growing self-esteem, growing sense of responsibility, and also some caring and empathy. Those are critical pieces. We can get more into this, I think, when we get to the some of the questions and answers. But let me turn it over to Dr. Biller. I think you're muted, Brett. You're muted.
There we go. Okay, so thank you, Dr. Carries. So a lot of what Dr. Carries is talking about is where we're going to continue on, and what we'll try to do with the remaining time that we have is really take what Dr. Carries was saying and provide it within a structure of a program that really assists parents with this positive and productive parenting, which Dr. Carries was talking about the principles of. And so while we're going to be talking about a no-hit zone, we're certainly not going to be presenting this program, but we're sort of going to be using it as a format for us today in order to provide examples, real specific examples of the principles that Dr. Carries was talking about. Before I go into what the no-hit zone is and where we come from, just want to summarize a little bit of what Dr. Carries was talking about and explain how we're going to see that in the program, the remainder of the program, what we're talking about. So Dr. Carries talked about positive and productive parenting. And some of the things he talked about, which are very important, was recognizing the personal differences between children and adults and where we come from in parenting, but the importance of having a plan. So it's, if you were to think about something you would do at work or something you would do at sports or anything else that you really go into, whether it's an art or something else, we're going to have a plan typically beforehand. So even think about the presentation that we're talking about today is we have a structure, we have an idea of where we're going to go so that we could lead the way, but along the way, there's going to be things that are going to happen and we have to know how to respond to that. That's just like parenting. Parenting is part of life. So if we think of it from that perspective, is we're going to, as a parent, we want to guide a child. We want to model their behaviors that are going to bring them to an ability to do that for themselves as they grow older. Communication is certainly important, a part of that. And we know that communication is both verbal and physical. We could tell a lot from a child on how they are feeling or get a clue based not just of what they're saying, but what they're doing. And sometimes what they're doing gives us a better sense, in fact, of how they're feeling or something that's going on. So we want to talk about that. We're going to continue to talk about that. And we want to build self-esteem while establishing boundaries and guidelines. And we're going to talk a little bit about where there's certainly importance of a relationship between loving kindness and boundaries and guidelines. It's something that we want to see with children. So parenting essentially is an opportunity to provide examples that we would like to see in our children. So the no-hit zone came initially from a pediatrician at the Cincinnati Baby and Children's Hospital when she saw disrespect, frustration in parenting towards children, but what that led to was an escalation to physical parenting, physical aggression. So she developed this program for her hospital called the No-Hit Zone. And in that program, it was focused on the concept of physical discipline However, where we've come from 2005 until now is really understanding the foundation of the last resort, which is physical discipline, and where it comes from a sense of an emotional place and how it negatively impacts children. So we see, as you see, is since 2005, there's been a gradual progression of understanding the negative impact of what we call corporal punishment. And we see that there's research that says that corporal punishment is a significant risk factor in other concerns. In fact, in the child abuse world, we see where there's physical violence or physical aggression, even if it's legal, not illegal in the home, we see other forms of maltreatment, concerns regarding social development and emotional. And then we get to the physical impact, where we see in 2009, there's two studies at Harvard. Some of you may have heard that university, it's pretty established. So it's a credible research that showed that physical discipline even has an impact on the developing brain, the gray matter that impacts children's decision making, their ability to learn, all these things. So we see it's not just an emotional impact, that once we lose our cool and get to physical discipline, it has an impact on learning, social, and emotional. It got to a point that in the distant past, in 2018, the American Academy of Pediatrics, that governs and provides guidelines for medical care, or pediatric medical care, has changed their policy from a statement of considering alternatives to physical discipline, but recommending that parents not use physical discipline. So where are we now? We're going to talk about here at Hackensack University Medical Center in the north, but here at Hackensack Meridian Health Network, we've established this no hit zone program in order to really help you guys in the community understand the impact of physical discipline, but really to get a sense of how do we employ what Dr. Carries was talking about, is positive and productive parenting in a productive manner. So we can go on to the next slide. Okay, so that's what I want to spend the rest of the time doing, is really talking about how do we implement positive and productive parenting. We're going to go through the no hit zone is something that any of you guys could register or sign up for. We have online program, in-person programming, and you could reach out. Our contact information will be at the end. But more important today is really like to use it as a foundation to understand how do we pragmatically employ some of what Dr. Carries was talking about. So if we see the initial session for no hit zone is really coming from where we are at as parents. So the first session is talking about the center of parenting, which is who we are. And we want to validate our thoughts and our feelings. Parenting is very difficult. So we need to understand that some of our history of where we come from in parenting is based on religious ideas, some are cultural ideas, and we want to come from a place of validating that because we don't have all the answers, because you don't have the answers, doesn't mean you're a bad parent, doesn't mean you're not a success. So from the foundation, let's start with that. Here today, we want to know that even if you have a question about parenting, even if you're not exactly feeling successful in all parenting aspects, that's normal and that's okay. You're seeking out information, you're exploring your child is where we want to start off as parenting. So that's the foundation. We are going to be the foundation and the example we provide to our children in parenting. So then let's look at what we would move into in the next stage of understanding appropriate or productive parenting. And that's providing an understanding from where do we come from in understanding parenting. And a lot of this is understanding of the medical impact of discipline, the mental health impact of discipline. But like Dr. Carries was talking about, we really want to raise responsible, healthy, emotionally healthy adults and children. So we want to come from modeling that place. So we have a foundation for ourselves, and we want to model mentally how we would respond to emotions, how would we respond to verbal redirection. And we have to understand that where we come from, some of it is cultural, some of it is religious. In fact, we talk about that a lot of folks, when we talk about this, will say is, well, I have resorted to physical discipline because it says so in the Bible. But in actuality, in most religions, religious leaders will say that's a misconception. That quote that we've heard of spare the rod, spoil the child, is actually a misconception. And most religions come from a place of, in fact, every religion, if you look at some of the research, comes from a place of guiding children. And that's exactly what we talk about in positive and productive parenting, is guiding the children or guiding them. And so the staff used in the Bible is used for guiding. It's not actually used as something that's for punishment. All right, so let's move on to the next slide. Okay, so we've been talking a lot about parents being the center of parenting. And that comes from an important place of, when we're going to parent, we have to come from a place of best regulating ourselves. And so there's needs to be, if you look at your parenting, we want to have a relationship between loving kindness and boundaries. So if we were to think about this, if we were to ask each one of you who are participating today, what's better? Loving kindness, parenting, from a parenting perspective, what's better? Loving kindness or discipline and guidelines and being strict? And most of you say, well, loving kindness is really what's best. It sounds good, it feels better. But we really want to come from a place in self-regulating ourselves, and there be a relationship between loving kindness to our children as well as boundaries and structure. If we think about, we're not looking at a balance, because a balance would need to take from one to give to the other, but really, where do we come from in modeling loving kindness and boundaries that we want to see for our children? So we want to provide loving kindness as an example. We want to tell children how we feel about them positively. And we want to also be okay establishing boundaries. And when we establish boundaries or rules, we want to make sure that they're rules that we can follow up with ourselves, because the most difficulties we have in providing rules and boundaries are when we don't establish them in advance or think ahead of what we can do that's going to work for us, and then we fall back on providing those boundaries and we don't follow through with those boundaries and support. Next is, we want to go, I'm sorry, if we could stay on to that, is the next part of that is parenting from a positive perspective and promoting resilience and self-esteem. One of the things that we always use an example that's difficult to understand is what's developmentally appropriate from a child and what's a place that we think our child is being defiant, whether it's intentionally or not. An example I use is oftentimes when we see young children who may be sitting at the high chair or sitting at their table, and they take food and they throw the food on the ground, and they laugh or they look at us and they look for a reaction. That's a good example that we would have to, first of all, we want to understand self-esteem. We want to understand resilience. We want to understand child development. That example may not be something of defiance. We may perceive that as defiance, but it may be something called permanent object permanency, where a child is exploring, if something is out of sight, what happens to it? How do we react to that? So it comes to the idea too of parenting is we have to understand the story versus the narrative. The story is certainly what's happening in the moment. The child just threw something on the ground. It's making us feel angry. It's really frustrating to us. And then the narrative is what we put onto that is they've done this intentionally. They're being oppositional intentionally. And we have to work with our own emotions to recenter ourselves and say, no. The story is that they threw something on the ground. It may be related to something oppositional, but it also may be developmentally appropriate. So I want to respond to that in the appropriate way and not overreact and become punitive, but understand it. So maybe ask questions or explore different types of responses and understand our anger that's going to be natural. We also want to plan ahead. We heard Dr. Carey's talking about having a parenting plan. We want to develop those rules so that we know ourselves and our partners or family members or communities that are helping us, how are they going to assist us in responding to those things and how we are going to set that up. So One of the things that Dr. Carey's talked about is positive opposites, and those are alternatives to behavior. So for instance, if your child is hitting a sibling or hitting somebody else, what's a positive opposite that they could do? So the behavior is hitting, it's physically aggressive. What's something that they can do? So a positive opposite is taking something positive or making a physical act more positive. So they may be frustrated with their sibling. They may be angry with their sibling. So how do we have that child act on their feelings in a positive way rather than a negative way? So one of those examples is provide a child an opportunity to go to a different room, and if they need to hit a pillow, or if they need to cross their arms. So that's something oftentimes when we see kids who have difficulty with stealing, where they're taking, when they're young, taking candy from the convenient checkout lines, want to keep their hands folded and teach them to ask, is this is something I want? Mom, dad, grandma, grandpa, whoever's the caregiver, is this something that that I can have? And really want to build social support around that. So you want to try to build your network of support to see how you could be supported in your parenting. Go ahead, next slide. All right, want to look at responding to misbehavior. It's going to, first, we want to sit in the stance of understanding that misbehavior is going to happen. It's a way that children explore their world around them. And so if we think about it, we want to model to them how we would want children to respond. So if we think about the difference between praise and punishment, many of you have heard of, we want to catch children doing something good. We want to, so rather than focusing on the negative, we want to focus on the positive. So that's one part of praise versus punishment. We want to identify that which they're doing well and boost them up and understand where we're coming from in punishment. A lot of times punishment is due to our own frustration and anger. So we want to explore, is this punishment coming from our own emotion? And is it consistent if we have to get to that point of punishment? Is it consistent with the behavior? So one of the examples that Dr. Carey was talking about is, if a child is refusing to wake up to go to school, or they're not eating, what we've told them, the consistent response would be, explaining to them is, for the food example, is this is what we're going to eat tonight. This is what I prepared. Here's the reasons for it. And the natural consequences, if they choose not to eat that, then they may go a little bit hungry. But we provide an opportunity of boundaries. Say, okay, if you're not willing to eat this now, this is what we're available to eat. We may provide an opportunity for them to eat a little bit later on or so forth. But you have to understand what benefits you. That's setting the natural progression up in advance. Move to the example of active ignoring is we really want to get to, sorry, I didn't mean to move to the next slide. Active ignoring is understand what's attention seeking and what are things that we can ignore so that we could monitor ourselves, our own emotions, but also not feed into something such as one of the examples and one of the questions we got in advance is tantrums. Active ignoring is a technique we could use with tantrums. Sometimes tantrums are for different purposes. One is it may be attention seeking. One is because a child may be tired. Another one is because they emotionally don't know how to respond in that moment. So what we want to do in active ignoring is take a moment to initially ignore it. And this is what we find is real problematic in tantrums. It's hard to ignore, particularly in public, because what we want to do is immediately stop the behavior because it's embarrassing to us. We need to recognize the first step in tantrums and recognizing is every parent has dealt with a tantrum. So more often than not, the parent who sees this tantrum going on, the other parents, the other individuals there, they feel for you. They don't, they're not judging you. They're not. So that's the first thing is we're going to see the parent as the center. You're going to look at yourself and say, okay, I need to address the thoughts and feelings before I address the behavior. So first is the active ignoring. As long as the child's not hurting themselves, they're not hurting anybody else, And then we want to address the feeling, is we want to address, Sally, Johnny, whoever the child is, we understand that you're upset and we're going to allow you to be, but here's not the place that we can be upset. And if we want, we bring them outside, we change the environment, whatever. We want to validate the feeling and then try to get at the behavior. And it's, of course, difficult in each situation because every situation is different, but we want to understand the differences in each child, both in the situation, their temperament, as well as their response to how you do that. But active ignoring is helpful in slowly getting into the behavior. When we do have to get to punishment, we have to understand that we want punishment to be consistent. We want it to be appropriate for the child's developmental age. We want to be in a neutral tone. We don't want it to be something that is in totality negative. We want it to be a guideline. It wants to be a learning experience because that's what parenting is. Parenting is really, like we've said, is providing a model for how children are going to react moving forward. What we want to do is want to make sure that the punishment is appropriate for the behavior. So if, as an example, something very difficult for parents right now is having children not use their electronics day in, day out and engage in other behaviors. So a punishment before we get to the punishment, is setting the appropriate boundaries of, this is the time we're going to use our electronics. Here's the reason that we're setting this time for electronics. Here's a reason that we're going to do other activities other than electronics, and here's the benefit of it. And also establishing, here's the consequence. And the consequence should be ignoring, I was reading the course, should be something related to electronic use. So if you go over your electronic use today, then you lose the allotted time for tomorrow because it's specifically related to the electronic use. And then obviously the model for managing specific behaviors within the no-hit zone program is really going to get at what we want is the specific concerns that we see in the group and providing support for each other. I'm going to leave off with that because we want to certainly provide an opportunity for questions and answers. I know a lot of this was general because of time. That's what allows us to. But hopefully we can answer more specific questions in the question answer portion. But if you're really interested also in getting into the specifics of these different examples that we used, feel free. Our contact information is available if you're interested in signing up for these positive and productive parenting groups as part of our no-hit zones or zone of respect program. We certainly can get into that in more detail and specific detail for each one of your concerns. So that is another opportunity as well. There's a little pitch for both in-person as well as virtual programs that we could get specifically into your parenting concerns. But why don't we open it? I don't know if Allison, if you're going to, or Sarah, are going to lead the questions, or if we would just want
to. I'll lead it.
Okay,
so some of the questions that we just got in from our chat was, is it better to ignore a tantrum as a better solution? I clearly do not want to yell at a child in a store or at all, but if you want to give a feedback to that, Dr. Biller, I know you just mentioned that too, or Dr. Carey.
Yeah, I can talk about it. So yes, as I was saying, yelling at the store is not a great thing. So what's a logical consequence of a child yelling and making a complete disaster of the trip? Logical consequence, they don't go next time. So next time they stay home and somebody else takes care of them, and you end the shopping trip and you take them home. Then you can try it again. Talk about what's going to happen. Try it again. If it doesn't work, and you may have to miss the next couple of times. So, but yes, yelling is not constructive. It just leads to a lot more attention and fighting, and it's I don't think it gets you anywhere.
I also, jumping off of that is I think it's important that if we're going to be modeling is, obviously we want to ignore that where we can. If it's not possible, we want to address the child's feelings and your feeling as the parent. And the reason that we're addressing your feeling as a parent is because you're modeling for the child how to express themselves in an appropriate manner. So a lot of times tantrums are because the child is either attention seeking or they're overwhelmed. So are they tired? Are they frustrated or whatever? The problem is how they address it. It's not that they're addressing it. So we want to express that to the child is, listen, I'm willing to hear you. However, when you're yelling and screaming like this, I'm not able to. It is concerning to me because I'm afraid with what you're doing, or I'm scared for how you're acting, or I'm disappointed in your acting. Tell me, what's your feelings that are behind this behavior, and try to model that as best as you can.
Right. But again, in the end, you want to have a consequence that's logical, that actually makes sense to you and to the child.
Just to address the question that's in there, Gerardo's, it's really important to show them love. And at the same time, love is important, but boundaries and guidelines are particularly important as well. And there has to be a relationship between them. And a child won't fear you if it's one of the things that is a misconception. If we have strict guidelines and if we're disciplined and so forth, that's going to be perceived as not love. And it's not. There's a relationship between guidelines and love, and a child will understand and feel loved as long as we're consistent with our structure, support, and our guidelines.
Thanks. We had so many great questions that came in from our attendees before this webinar. So I want to first jump into those, and I'll also be jumping into the chat where we're getting some great questions. So just to start, because we discussed how are we going to handle so many great questions, we selected based on trends, sort of the theme of different topics. And I'll throw the first question to Dr. Carey. How should you deal with children cursing in the home when one parent is completely against it and the second parent casually ignores it? So differences in opinion on that.
Right. Well, that brings up a huge point, which is both parents have to be on the same page. It's not constructive. It's not supportive to have one parent pro and one parent con. Cursing to me is very disrespectful. It's very, I think, belittling. It really digs at who that person is. So I'm not a big fan of anybody cursing. Oftentimes they've learned the cursing from adults around them. They don't learn it from other sources usually. But I guess my biggest point is both parents have to get together. They have to have an approach that works. Otherwise, whatever you do as one parent is not going to be particularly constructive.
Thank you. Dr. Biller, dealing with I guess we did sort of speak to tantrums already. Is there anything else you want to add, though, on how to respond to a tantrum?
No, but I'll jump off to the next one that it's kind of related to is tantrum. This is good because we have a specific example of how do we deal with that.
Yeah.
So we need to look at the foundation of the reason for the tantrum and what it may be. And if we're able to, in using this example of there's a tantrum because the child hates the car seat, we could often reframe the use of the car seat and understand what is, not in the moment where the child is resisting getting in the car seat, but better understand the reason that they don't want to be in the car seat and address that. And there are different ways for developmentally. But for instance, at a 16-month-old or even earlier to avoid it, you want to make getting into that car seat is something that's more pleasurable rather than feeling pinned down or restricted or something else. We want to understand, make it fun, whether we start singing songs, we get excited to get in the car seat, or reframing it is that car seat is, for that's something that we're going to do when we go on an adventure, whether it's, we could pretend that is your space shuttle. One of the parents I've worked with, we actually used the car seat as a space shuttle adventure seat, and that they were going to strap themselves in and they were going to go on an adventure. And the first 5 or so minutes of the car ride was a fictitious adventure that they were going on, and then led it into a more pleasurable experience. So it's really understanding what is the concern with the car seat. Is it the feeling of restriction? Is it fear? And then making it more of a pleasant experience, a positive experience, and understanding also explaining to the child where you come from is wanting to keep them safe. Our job as a parent is wanting to keep them safe. And although it may not be comfortable, we still want to make sure they're as safe as possible.
Those are some great suggestions. I'm taking studious notes from my 2-year-old upstairs. So thanks for that. Now, switching to another sort of specific example, Dr. Curies, what's the best way to communicate with your child when they might be running late to school?
Yeah, that's comes up a lot. And as I said, I think most parents tend to get upset, get angry. But in the end, they get them to school. They don't want them to be late. So in the end, your response is very enabling. Whereas with a logical consequence, they have to deal with. They're going to be late. They have to deal with the consequence of being late, which is you let the school and the teachers know about what's happened, and let the school deal with it. It's their issue, not your issue that they're late, and let them deal with the consequences of being late.
Thank you.
One of the things before we jump on to the next question, I see that is coming up is a lot of questions about these examples that we give with it's harder in the moment and harder for single parents. And absolutely, these are all examples we're giving to help out. But to address that concern is it's certainly easier in the moment if it's addressed before the moment. Meaning the idea of positive parenting is having a plan of how we're going to react beforehand. It's sort of like when we have fire drills. Is obviously if we didn't have a plan beforehand, reacting in the moment in the breakdown is a lot more difficult. And that's the concept of whether it's a single parent or parents who have support. We really want to have a plan on how we're going to think about and address these situations in advance where we can. And it may not be the exact situation. However, it will help bring the emotions for us as a parent down, and it'll give us a sense of which tool we could reach to rather than just digging through the tool bag of what we can do in the moment. But it isn't easy when you're by yourself, when you're rushed, and we have to give a place for that and recognize that in the moment as well.
So the next question covers a lot of different things. So feel free to address what you think is most important. But the topic really just sort of speaks to when your child is being, defiant and seeking that attention and really putting out a negative, actions or words. How do you stay cool in those moments, and how do you de-escalate when that's happening?
Yeah, so like you said, there's a lot here in this question, and we need to consider the developmental age of the child. And so, for younger children, if you're noticing the pattern of defiance and so forth, we want to really explore from where is this coming? And even with older kids, we want to try to explore for ourselves, from where is this defiance coming? What is the reason for this defiance? And for younger kids, we want to model appropriate interactions, and we want to explain to the child how that defiance is making them feel, how that is perceived. And for older children or adolescents, we want to explore what's going on. And you call it out as, I noticed that you're doing X, Y, and Z. What is the reason? What is behind it? You want to address with that specific child, but we also want to make sure that we are not doing what I talked about before in creating a narrative that may not be there, meaning that there's a story there's the events that are occurring. We want to make sure that we're not creating a narrative that we perceive that this is just a defiant child who is always going to be defiant and is trying to tick me off because there's a divorce custody situation and they want to go live with the other person. That's a narrative that doesn't help us. We want to address the specifics in that moment. Is, listen, Sally, Johnny, whoever is, I've noticed this behavior. It's really impacting me this way. How are you feeling and where are you coming from? What's going on with you right now? And then we try to address it in that manner. And then afterwards, we could try to take a step back and address the bigger picture.
Let me just say, because I think we're getting towards the end of the time. It's not easy being a parent, obviously, and and sometimes it's much harder. Some kids have particular behaviors or temperaments or self-esteem issues themselves. Certainly, as kids get older with their own lives, they have issues that they bring back home, and they put all the emotions and attention onto their parents. So it's not easy, and you have to be flexible, but you do have to be able to step back and think about what's happening, not just react. I think that's usually gets you into a lot of hot water. And always step back and say, I'm going to come back to you later about these sorts of things. And sometimes you just need help, sometimes you just need help with a counselor, a teacher, somebody outside of the family to be able to sit down and work with you. Sometimes your pediatrician. Sometimes you just need to get some support, particularly when things are not going properly.
So speaking of support, I just wanted to show this last slide, and I'll go back to the Q&A in a moment, but for those who need to depart the presentation earlier, I wanted to be sure to share with you information on the positive and productive parenting coaching groups for those who might want to continue this dialogue and learn more. Feel free to take down that email at nohitzone@hmhn.org. We're also sharing the contact information for Dr. Biller and Dr. Carries if you'd like to speak to them one-on-one. And following this presentation, you'll be receiving the recording of this presentation as well as a feedback survey, which we really encourage you to fill out and join other future presentations that we have on different parenting topics. So I'll leave it on, you can leave it on this screen, Allison, but I just want to mention the last question that we received earlier that we sort of plucked out was on brushing teeth and sort of that escalation when a child might be resisting that. Maybe in sort of the same vein that you gave an example with the car seat, Dr. Bill or Dr. Carries, if you can give some other examples of how to approach that in a creative way.
Yeah, so absolutely. I think that even jumping off of what Dr. Carries just said is it really takes preparation and thought ahead. And one of the things too is not to be ashamed when things don't go right. We all plan, and even with the best plans, things aren't going to go right. So when things aren't going right as parents, reach out for help where you can get it. And, as I guess a shameless plug for the parent coaching groups, we're going to really take an individual perspective of exploring things as they go wrong for each individual who participates in those groups, and come up with examples and share amongst each other from a non-judgmental, understanding place. But to get back to that specific question is, it's one of those examples where brushing the teeth is something that you really want to plan from at an early stage and establish that foundation. So oftentimes it's a gradual progression of behaviors from really just putting, a flavorful toothpaste on the child's toothpaste, getting them to get in the act of putting the toothbrush in their mouth, and eventually getting to brush their teeth. So if you have a child who, you haven't built that in at that point, you just want to progressively get to a behavior that's going to get them to brush their teeth. So whatever way you could gradually guide them into the behavior you want, with the expectation that we're not going to have the end behavior occur right away.
Let me I was just going to add to that I think sometimes it's just see if you can just have fun with your kids. Sometimes, it's having a kid should be fun. If it's not fun, then there's something that really needs to get corrected. But you can brush teeth together. There's a lot of things you can do. There's a big concept in child development called serve and volley, which means your job is to kind of watch your kids and see what they're serving. They're telling you things, whether by play or by doing things, or to try to figure out what they're telling you, and then you volley back based on where they're at. If you can kind of understand where they're at and volley back and support that, it just gets you a lot further, whether it's reading a book or whether it's playing or whether it's just kind of sharing these kind of things with them. But it's not just about timeout and about positive parenting. It's about enjoying your child, having fun with your kids, and helping them to grow to be better kids.
And get creative. And, having fun is a lot of time is trying to be as creative as possible. And so if, brushing teeth is something that kids don't like in their mouth, it doesn't feel good or whatever it is, we want to get to that stage of let's turn on music. Let's, maybe make this a fun activity. Like Dr. Carey said, is brush your teeth with your children, or have a child, brush your teeth at a certain, obviously that's not going to be your end all of brushing. Hopefully you'll do a more comprehensive job yourself. but to show that it's not as threatening and it's not as a control issue, and it's something that can be enjoyable.
Thank you. So we're at time, but I wanted to see if Dr. Biller or Dr. Curious has a few more moments to answer a few more of the questions that have come in.
Sure.
In another 5 minutes, perhaps.
Okay, I know you guys have some appointments, so it's totally fine if you need to hop off. But I do want to just take a moment to thank you so much for both presenting today and giving us, imparting some knowledge onto us parents. I just want to mention also for those who are still on that our next parenting presentation will be on November 30th, addressing common digestive issues for children. Now, jumping back to the Q&A that we received during the presentation, one of our attendees, Linda, was sort of speaking to how to change the perspective of her son, who has sort of a negative perspective on some situations. How do you help? I know you'd spoken to modeling, but if any other suggestions for how to, help in those moments where there might be that kind of perspective from her child?
Yeah, I saw that. So I'm not sure. I guess I need to know more about all that. Is the child doing that to make the parent feel guilty? Is that their way of trying to respond by making the parent feel that they're the goat for all this sort of stuff? Or is that child actually having a lot of self-esteem issues themselves and using their parent as kind of a background support for them? So I need to know more about it. But usually when kids get really negative about things, there's something in the background that you have to better understand. I don't really understand enough about that to be able to answer that more than that.
I agree with that. It's sometimes explaining is trying to understand what is the reason for the pattern of responding is challenging, but also fruitful. And modeling also the difference between, if you see a negative pattern of thoughts and feelings, modeling a difference in using examples. One of the examples that I use with kids, with parents to help them with children who have difficulty with some negative concepts is the concepts of, that even on a cloudy day, the sun is above that. So we may not be able to see the positive, but it's still there. The sun is always there. There's always a positive. How do I see the sun through the clouds?
So I know Dr. Curious had to jump off now because of other appointments. We have one more question. If Dr. Biller, if you want to answer it. It's from our attendee Aminata, asking sort of just about power dynamics in a family. If one parent, has the authority and one that struggles to get sort of being listened to by the children, is there any sort of suggestion that you'd have how that affects the children or how to help that dynamic?
Yeah, that's something that the family need, the adults, the adults in the family who need to discuss with themselves and discuss not just the impact of the parenting, but the emotional aspect of that, and the importance of staying together. I use an example all the time in parenting. Teenagers actually provide us the best example on how to co-parent. And what I mean by that is, if you see, is there could be teenagers that at every moment are at each other's throat and are, they can't stand each other. However, when they want something from us as parents, they are thick as thieves, and you cannot divide them in any cost. And it's kind of what parenting needs to be at times too, is if you have a support person with you and you're not parenting on your own, is even if you don't agree, you need to be able to stick with the plan that you identify with your co-parent and not address it in front of the children. So if you have a disagreement about the parenting, is you discuss it afterwards and say, listen, I really don't agree with what we're talking about. I agreed in the moment because of X, Y, and Z. How do we revisit this? How do we, develop a plan that works for both of us, and then revisit it with your children together as a unit? Because what happens is, in the example you're talking about, is children learn to bifurcate or divide their parents in a manipulative manner. And that's not going to benefit either of the parent who's seen as the authority figure, or the parent who is seen as less of an authority figure. So it's something you need to address with your co-parent in a plan.
The last question we'll throw from our audience that came in was really just how do you help your child accept no when that's sort of the answer on, Susie gave the example of when a child asked, maybe could we read another chapter of the book? And the answer is no. How do you sort of help the child accept that?
Yeah, so that's one of those that it's establishing something at the onset, and providing an example is where we need to be, meaning that before you sit down is have the expectation. Okay, so we're going to read X, Y, and Z chapters because it's important that you get enough sleep and so forth. And we need to be consistent from the get-go. If we're consistent with that from the beginning, then children know what the appropriate expectations are. And you respond in a place of love and kindness. I love you. I still would love to be able to read, but this is where we are. And we said we were going to read 3 chapters. And I love you so much. I want you to be able to get enough sleep. And I can't wait for tomorrow when we could read the next chapter after that. And really keep it from a positive perspective, even though there are times that we're going to want to rip our hair out and yell and scream ourselves, is have both that relationship between the loving kindness and the boundaries and present them both together, and be consistent with that.
So Dr. Biller, I'm sorry, there actually were a few more questions. Do you have time to answer them?
Sure. Yeah, I have about another 10 minutes or so that I can answer those.
Okay, great. So from Linda, she gave an example of the use of scare tactics, and she was saying our 3-year-old ran ahead on a safe path, but a grandparent yelled at a bear that each children would come out of the woods. What could she have said to sort of maybe keep the child closer to the group of family?
So one of the things is, so the research shows that truthfully scare tactics don't work in the long run. If you could personally connect with the child from where your fear is coming, that is usually helpful. So that's where we have that, if we were to use the example again of the relationship between loving kindness and boundaries is, you can't go ahead because I'm concerned for your safety, and be more realistic. I don't want you to trip and hurt yourself. That would make me sad. I would be disappointed. I want to make sure you're safe. I'm coming from a place of really wanting to keep you safe, and you may not realize it because you're a really great runner. So you're positive in praising that. And you're really a great explorer. I'd love to explore with you. Let's explore together so that we're all safe. And sometimes mommy and daddy aren't great with finding their way down the path where you may be. So I want to make sure I have you as that explorer to move forward and explore together. So that's an example. And then, of course, address it with the grandparent or something, the concern that you have afterward, not in front of the child.
It's a great example. Thank you. And from Diana, it was a 2-part question. She was asking for her 6-year-old, how to sort of keep her child's attention, stay focused without having to raise her voice. Do you have any suggestions for that?
Yeah, and that's something that is very difficult to do for any of us, because when we raise our voice, it's about our emotions. It's similar to the concept of typically in physical discipline, none of us really, if thought out, would want to use physical discipline. It's something that we resort to as a last resort when we're very angry and we've lost control. And typically, that's what yelling is about too. It's about the emotion behind what's going on. So it's either fear that our child has done something that we don't want them to, or anger that they're doing something that we don't want them to. So we want to, first of all, recognize in ourselves, there are many times we're going to lose it. We're going to yell at them. It doesn't mean you're a bad parent. It doesn't mean you're an awful person. One of the things you do is model to your kids, listen, I know I just yelled at you. I don't love yelling at you. Here's where I'm coming from. I was really angry that we didn't seem like we're a team on that. We had talked about, not running ahead, and you agreed to that. We were on the same team, but then you didn't. And I was really, that made me sad, or that made me angry. I want to keep you safe. So one of them is taking accountability for the yelling when it does happen. Explain from where you're coming, because then you're modeling for your child how to deal with emotions, that they're allowed to get angry. It's going to happen. And they take responsibility or accountability. If you're realizing you're escalating before you yell, is notice that in yourself. If it's safe, take a mindful moment to bring yourself down, to allow yourself, I'm allowed to be angry here. This makes sense. And I'm not going to respond from that anger. and I'll feel, how do I deal with that anger, separately. So if you're able to, before you start yelling, give a place for that anger or whatever feeling is at the center of that yelling, that it's at the foundation, and allow it to exist, because it's allowed to. We're adults, we're going to get scared, we're going to get fearful, and respond from a place that we would like to see how our children respond. If we've already done it, take accountability, explain from where it comes from, and have that both loving kindness moment, but boundaries, and explain what's acceptable and not acceptable, and use yourself as an example.
That was eye-opening. Thank you. The second part of Fanny's question was just going back to tantruming. And, the parents get a lot of different suggestions on how to respond, ignore it, comfort it. And she was sort of referencing, how should we hug the toddler just as a support to get them through the tantrum? What would you suggest?
Tantrum is one of the most difficult things to manage as parents. And if you think about it, the reason is because your child's already at the point of they've lost it. Whatever skills they have, whether it's dealing with their emotions, thinking through whatever, have been exhausted at that point. And so you have to recognize that and know the child individually. If you think hugging the child is going to be helpful and safe, absolutely. Hug them, reassure them, saying, listen, I know where you're coming from with this anger. I'm not really specifically sure, but it really, as best I know you're angry. I love you. Let's see if we both can calm down, because I'm scared, I'm upset, and let's share talking about our feelings and what we want to happen after that. So if you can with your child, absolutely, there's nothing wrong with it. If you're in a safe environment where you could allow the child to express their feeling, and you know that after their tantrum and they're not going to be harmful to themselves, you could then approach it. That's the best way to do it as well. So for some kids, ignoring the tantrum is an okay, safe option. For some kids, hugging them and bringing them closer is a safe option. It's really knowing your child. But before that is, if you could understand the escalation of what leads to your child tantruming, and if you could get it before that point, obviously that's the ideal situation. It doesn't always work out that way. But also understand is, whatever feeling you have, it's valid, whether it's fear, embarrassment, shame. Have that at the center before you respond. Give a place for that, even if it's 2 or 3 seconds. Okay, I'm embarrassed as heck. I know that's an appropriate response because my child's tantrum, and then react to the emotion behind the tantrum, because maybe a child just is exhausted, and you recognize, okay, they're exhausted. I need to take them. Let's go. We're going to get you out into a car where you can fall asleep and take a nap.
Thank you again so much, Dr. Biller, for this extra time. And for those who were able to join and continue to stay on with us, I hope you found this a great lecture. It's really always a wonderful opportunity to learn from you, Dr. Biller. So thank you for that. Again, for those who are on the call, be sure to take note of any, if you're interested in attending our positive and productive parenting coaching groups, the sign up email is right there on screen, nohitzone@hmhn.org, or please join us at our next parenting class on November 30th and sign up. Again, recordings will be sent out after this call, and we wish you all a wonderful day. Thank you so much.
Thank you, guys.